So welcome to the May 3rd, 2018 program of the Tucson Cactus and Succulent Society. Our speaker tonight is Bill Thornton. Bill is a longtime member of the Society, a native Arizonan, an author of numerous articles concerning the desert. His presentation is entitled Our Vanishing Cactus. Please join me in welcoming Bill Thornton.
Did you turn it on?
Oh, that's better. Helps to turn it on, doesn't it?
Do you want
I got the point. Okay. I just need to turn it on. Okay.
Okay, how's it working now? All right. When you're my age and you hear about some of the things these young people are doing, it's got to give you some inspiration and some hope for the future. And so my congratulations, and I think all of us, to these young people who are kind of our next generation of scientists coming along. I believe we actually did a cactus rescue out at the site of that school in July of 2016. And there was a young man who came out with us with my group who was here visiting from Green Bay, Wisconsin, and he got a butt full of choy as soon as he stepped out of the truck. And I said, welcome to the Sonoran Desert. Okay. Well, if you read my bio, you've noticed that I'm a lifelong cactus hugger, as are most of us here. And if you read the paper, I think Dick may have referred to it, you know that I'm not bashful about expressing my opinion when I feel that I have something worth saying. I think we're all aware on some level, all of us who are cactus enthusiasts are aware on some level that of all of the reports of wild populations of cacti that have been seriously decimated by overcollecting. I think we're all aware of that on some issue. I started taking a special interest in endangered cacti a few years back when I had some seeds, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but I have some seeds from an endangered Nichols Turk's Head cactus, a legal plant, legally salvaged, and I offered them to my friend Dan Bach and said, would you like to try growing some of these? And he said, well, I'd love to, but I really can't afford it because I couldn't sell any plants that I grow. So I thought, well, I want to take a little more look. It doesn't make any sense to me on that level. If you have a legal plant, legally salvaged, why can't you grow plants from that legal plant and sell them? Well, we'll get into that some more later when we talk about the Endangered Species Act and what it does or doesn't do. Okay, well, we have almost 500 species of endangered cacti, and let's look at some of the factors that have put them into this condition, some of the threats that they're facing. Okay, well, habitat destruction has gone on in many areas, and these are not all of the causes, but they're important. Conversion to agriculture, mining, lots of cactus habitat is lost every year to all of these activities. Here's a big one, is plant poaching. This, we cannot say, Bill Peachy and I noticed this when we were out. We've been doing some field work on Nichols Turk's Head cacti over the last few months. And we noticed this hole here in the ground that's just about the right size and depth to where a Nichols Turk's Head may have been there. But we don't know. We don't know what was there before the hole. So we can't say for sure whether this is evidence of poaching or not. But we do know that there's been a huge market. A huge market has been created by the internet, and thousands of plants are poached every year and sold worldwide. Okay, let's talk first I have about 3 Arizona species I want to talk about quickly. The Nichols Turk's Head, I have a plant here for when the break comes, we can do a little show and tell here. I have my legally salvaged plant. This is a subspecies of a common Chihuahuan desert cactus, and I also have one of the Chihuahua desert varieties here tonight, so you can look at the two and see if you can tell the difference between them. There's two isolated populations of this plant in southern Arizona, and there's one down in Sonora, Mexico. My old cactus books all have this as Echinocerius horizontaloneus. Somewhere along the line, they decided that the Arizona species was a distinct subspecies. So it was declared endangered and has all of the protection there it is in 1986. For every plant that is declared endangered, the Fish and Wildlife Service is charged with developing a recovery plan that essentially gives a blueprint for how they're going to protect the plant and keep it from going extinct. There's estimated population of 2,500. From the material you're looking at there, it would look like there's been really a severe decline in the numbers of these plants. We don't think, based on what we've seen, we don't think that these numbers are really indicative of the overall Nichols Turk's Head population out there. The test plots that were monitored for this study are in probably some of the worst conditions. They're hot, dry, south-facing slopes, and we think that in a little more favorable conditions than that, like down on some of the Bajadas where the soils don't dry out so fast after the summer rain, we think probably that the populations are a little bit better shape than what these numbers would indicate here. I've rated each one of these with the vulnerability to poaching. I consider the vulnerability of this plant for illegal collection to be very high because the populations are accessible. There's some that are even visible from the road out there, so it's something. And we think there's good reason to believe that plants have been poached from that area, but we don't have the proof. Okay, here's a couple of forms, and I want to, if you heard Rob Wallace's X-rated talk at the Sonoran 12 about cactus reproduction, you'll remember that a fruiting body on a cactus has the purpose of dispersing the seeds over as wide an area as possible. Well, the Nichols Turk's Head doesn't do such a good job in this area because you won't be able to see it much on this plant over here. Where's my, oops, I think I hit the wrong button. There we go. You won't be able to see it so much right now, but the fruiting bodies on these, as on all echinocactus, are a dry, woolly fruit. So they're not appetizing to birds or animals. So birds and animals are not going to be likely seed dispersers for this species. Now I can't get the red dot off there we go. Okay, so what tends to happen is the seeds will roll down the stem. See, here's the apex of the plant. The seeds will tend to roll down between this cage of spines and sprout down here at the base, germinate down here at the base. So what we have here is a family of young plants. Here's just a single seedling over here, and this is a family of young plants. Now, clusters of these are sometimes seen and mistaken for multi-headed plants when you really have like a whole little happy family there, or you might think of it like when your kids are in their 40s and still at home and haven't gotten the hint yet. You clip the apartment for rent ads out of the newspaper and set it down at the breakfast table and hope maybe they'll take the hint. Well, these tend to stick around. The seeds do get dispersed, however. I don't know what the vector is for dispersing seeds. It's probably insects of some sort. Okay, there's our red dot again. Just a couple of examples. One of the real distinct characteristics of the Nichols Turk's Head is this swirled rib pattern. And you tend to see these in the older and larger plants. This is about as big as they get over here. This plant is roughly a foot tall. And as you can see, it's one of its kids hasn't left the nest either, still hanging around. So, okay, now here's some unusual forms. Bill Peachy sent me a email, digital version of a report that was written up by the Arizona Game and Fish Department in 1999. And one of the statements they make about the Nichols Turk's Head is that it is invariably single-stemmed. Well, we didn't have to look very far to find. Now, these are not common. You don't see a lot of these double or triple. There's the triple over here. You don't see a lot of these, but they're not unheard of. So when you see something that's, such a glaring error, and you see it in print, it makes you wonder, did the people who wrote that ever, get out from behind their desk and go out and do any field work? Because you don't really have to look very hard to find some of these. Okay, now let's look at some of the leading threats. And I want to talk about buffalo grass. I think if you're not familiar with it, if you don't know what it is, you need to, because this is one of the leading threats to our entire Sonoran Desert ecosystem. And I'll go so far as to say that if we do not get it under control, it's far past the point where total eradication is even remotely possible. But if we don't get it under control, it will convert our Sonoran Desert, as we know it here, to something more resembling an African savanna. And the plants, the Sonoran Desert plants that we know, will be gone. It's a double threat. As you can see in this picture here, the stuff grows at a very dense. You see very little space in between the native plants there. This is just completely taken over. So it does two things. This will outcompete the native plants. This will suck up all the available moisture and nutrients out of the soil and will choke out the native plants that remain, the saguaros, the choyas, the ocotillas, and possibly an even more insidious threat is wildfires. When the stuff dries up, it burns. It can burn. All it takes is a spark to set it off. Buffalo grass fires, our Sonoran Desert vegetation is not fire adapted. This is not a fire adapted regime. Fires have been around as long as the Sonoran Desert has. Lightning caused fires, but before these invasive grasses, and buffalo grass isn't the only one, it happens to be the worst one in this area, but there's many others. Before it was here, there just wasn't enough fuel out there to fuel a very hot fire. A lightning strike would come along, and a little low-density fire would come, burn through. It would singe some of the plants. Many of the plants would survive. A few would be killed, but there just was not enough of a fuel load there to fuel a hot fire. Well, this was a game changer. We're talking about burn temperatures here hot enough to melt aluminum. When a desert burns from a buffalo grass fire, nothing survives. None of the original desert plants will survive. And the only thing that will ever grow again on a site like this is where buffalo grass has burned. The only thing that will ever survive there or ever regrow there is more buffalo grass. See, fire, as you probably know, grassland ecosystems are dependent on fire. They have to burn occasionally, and they have to be grazed. But depending on the variety of grass, our desert grasses don't grow as dense, and they don't burn as hot, and they're not a threat to the overall ecosystem. But when you bring in an invasive or bring in an exotic like this, the whole ball game changes. It would be hard-pressed, I'd be hard-pressed, and I think most of us would be, to think of whenever we have messed with the natural order of things, whether it's by, accidentally or on purpose, when we bring in something that doesn't belong here, when we bring in a non-native plant or animal. Uh, I can't think of a single example of when it's turned out well. Maybe there are some, but I'm not aware of them. But buffalo grass is really one of our major concerns here. But there's others. In parts of the Catalina foothills, fountain grass is the issue. In other areas, layman's love grass is the issue. That, again, was a deliberate introduction by the USDA to improve range conditions. Okay, conservation. We're going to talk a little bit about this is a really an amazing story of a habitat restoration effort that involved a lot of work over many years. There's a site there. We call it the Waterman Restoration Site. That's about maybe 25, 30 acres. What happened there is years ago, a man named Harlow Jones went in and bladed an airstrip for himself. Didn't ask anybody, just did it. An estimated 350 Nichols Turk's heads were destroyed in the process. Now, what he did, he just set the stage for buffalo grass to come in. And this entire site was solid buffalo grass. It was nothing but a sea of buffalo grass. My first time out there, I thought, God, we're going to try to dig all this. It's like emptying an Olympic-sized swimming pool with a teaspoon. You know, it's going to be a pretty tall order. Sandy Barr, God bless her, of the Sierra Club. I don't know if any of you know her, but Sandy Barr is a real ball of fire when it comes to getting after, well, in this case, getting after the Bureau of Land Management bureaucracy to convince them that you've got a real hazard here, and this is a clear and present danger to the Nichols Turk's Head, because this is right in the middle of prime Nichols Turk's Head habitat. Okay, so as I mentioned, trying to clear this whole site by hand wasn't even remotely possible. So what we did, we started off, here, let's advance this. We started nibbling around the edges. The idea was to contain this buffalo grass from spreading out into the surrounding desert where it would be a threat to the Nichols Turk's Head and everything else. Could keep the infestation confined to where this old airstrip was. So in the early days, we were digging it by hand, bagging it, and hauling it away. Okay. Well, Sandy, if you want to use a sports analogy here, you could say that Sandy led the team onto the field and started leading the team down the field. Then she handed off the ball to, okay, this was a group effort. The hand digging, the real heavy lifting here to clear, where's my red dot? Oh, help if I push the right button. There we go. Okay. Most of the clearing in here was done with a combination of glyphosate spraying, that's glyphosate herbicide, which you may know as Roundup is the trade name for it, plus going in with heavy equipment to remove the buffalo grass that was killed and plow little furrows into the ground so the rainwater would be retained on site and not run off. Native grasses and shrubs were reseeded, and this site has well, we say it's reclaimed. We say it's a successful project, but it's still a work in progress. John Schuring is out there probably every week looking for little sprigs of buffalo grass that have dared to come back, and when he finds one, it's gone real fast. But this is an amazing piece of ecological restoration. It's very it was costly, it's labor intensive and time consuming, and it's great, but it's not the kind of thing that's feasible to do on a very large scale. So if we want to keep some of our Sonoran Desert intact, we need to be out there removing the buffalo grass. And this doesn't necessarily mean you have to go out and hand dig it. In fact, the method of choice now has changed to the application of glyphosate herbicide. Very sad story. On an early buffalo grass dig, someone cut a desert tortoise in half because they call them gophers. They dig underground, and somebody in the process of whacking out a big clump of buffalo grass destroyed a desert tortoise. So that kind of caused everybody to take a step back and say, wait a minute, and you'll hear a lot of controversy about use of herbicides. Some people will no how, no way, will do it all by hand digging. Not even remotely possible. If we could turn out 10,000 volunteers every weekend from October through April, they might make a dent in it. But like it or not, the herbicide is necessary. There's a lot of scientific information about it. Some of the gloom and doom predictions made by the use of it have been debunked by other science. I'm not here to say that the use of herbicide is necessarily a great thing, but if we did not have that tool in the toolbox, we might as well just throw in the towel and let the buffalo grass go and take over the whole desert. It's a necessary ingredient if we want to make a dent in it. Okay, this was an amazing discovery. Earth Day, what did we have Earth Day? A couple of weeks ago? Okay, just Earth Day 2016, 2 years ago, when they were out monitoring the restoration site, they found a Nichols Turk's Head seedling reclaiming the site. This came in on its own. It wasn't planted, it wasn't seeded. So with some help from its friends, the desert can and does restore itself. Okay, another element of the conservation of this plant, there's a site out there, a rock quarry called Pioneer Materials, and they have salvaged several hundred plants from that site. Some have gone to ASDM, some have gone to DBG. These are some salvaged plants at ASDM that will be planted on the grounds. They're also growing some from seed, and here's a little seedling that's been propagated there in the greenhouse at the Desert Museum. I have a seedling here this evening too. I'll show you if you want to come up during the break. Oops. Okay, whoops. Well, there's the seedling again. Okay, you've already seen it. Okay, this is the next Arizona cactus I want to talk about. This is the Arizona hedgehog. This, for a long time, I believe, was classified in the Triglochidiatus group. It was considered one of the subspecies of Triglochidiatus. Later on, it was recognized as a distinct species in its own right. It was the first Arizona cactus to be listed as endangered. I've rated its vulnerability to poaching as low, and you'll see why in a minute here. I don't think there's plenty of threats to this plant, as you can see up here, but I don't think that this plant is a real high candidate for poaching, and we'll see why. Okay, so I want to go back and mention one thing. This was the first Arizona cactus listed, and I mentioned that Fish and Wildlife is supposed to develop a recovery plan for each species that's listed as endangered. Well, this was listed in 1979. We're going on 40 years, and they still have not finalized the recovery plan for this plant. Now, an early draft recovery plan called for propagation of up to 5,000 plants a year for the nursery trade. Well, since then, they've done an complete about face on that, and we'll talk about that some more later, too, because that's really a hot button issue for me. Okay, there's our little red dot. All right. Okay, conservation. If you've ever been out to dig plants out at the Silver Bell mine, you might be able to relate to this. This work took place in some pretty rugged terrain, and I think you can see this is the habitat that this plant grows in. I think you can see why I don't consider poaching to be a real serious threat for this species. The thieves, the plant poachers are going to go for the low-hanging fruit. They don't want to work this hard. They can dig other plants much easier. So I don't think we have to worry a lot about plant poaching. Now, this is a work crew from the Boyce-Thompson Arboretum. They are moving Arizona hedgehogs out of the right-of-way for widening U.S. Highway 60 between Superior and Globe. They moved about 31 plants altogether. Okay, here's some salvage plants, both in pots over here. Here's some cuttings that have been started, and here's some seedlings. So they've grown plants from cuttings and from seed. This is at Boyce-Thompson, and if you haven't been to Boyce-Thompson, it's well worth the effort. It's may not have all the variety that you have at DBG, but it's in the most beautiful natural setting probably of any botanical garden I've ever visited. So it's well worth the effort. It's not that far. It's just maybe hour and a half, 2 hour drive. I'd say probably closer to 2 hour drive from Tucson. Okay. There's another element of the conservation effort on this. West Lawn Resources was a contractor that was hired by Resolution Copper, was planning a big copper mine on that property, or in that general area. They did some research on their own. They took 1,000 cuttings from Arizona hedgehogs on private land. Now, since this was done on private land, they didn't have to go through all of the permitting process that they would have if it were on public land. So they got an 80% success rate on propagating these cuttings, and they determined that this was the method of choice, that propagating from cuttings was the most favorable method. And I'm going to talk about cuttings on these a little bit more in a minute. There was another highway widening project that the Fish and Wildlife Service got involved in, and Kathy Robertson from Fish and Wildlife contacted Dan Bach and I and asked for some input from us, and what we suggested was exactly what they did on this plant, was that they dig the plants and allow them a hardening off period before replanting. We also recommended that they take one or more cuttings from each plant that they dig. So a big hot item for Fish and Wildlife Service, and rightfully so, is they want to maintain the integrity of the gene pool. Now, we know that no matter how careful we are, we're not going to get a 100% success rate when we transplant any plant from a wild plant from one location to another. Our cactus rescue program, we do very well, but we get good success rates if people follow our instructions we give them. But we fall short of 100%. Now, the reason for cuttings would be if the relocated plant dies, then you've got a clone. You have a genetically identical clone to keep the gene pool intact. So since that's a prime interest of Fish and Wildlife, we thought, well, that's a reasonable thing to do. Well, they considered what we told them and said, no, we can't do it that way. We don't have the time. We don't have the budget. It would take too long to issue the plants and yada, yada. So they moved them, relocated them upslope, I've been told, upslope from where they were. And I believe Thomas Stute is here this evening, and I think he worked on this project, so he knows a lot more about it than I do. They don't have, it's too soon to have any hard data on the survival rate of the relocated plants, but Kathy Robertson did share with me that they are drought stressed, as is just about everything out there right now. So relocating in a time of prolonged and severe drought doesn't bode real well for the transplant success rate. Okay, let's go on and look at one more Arizona plant, and I believe Thomas and John Durham have both worked on this one too. This is the Pima pineapple cactus, which you've probably heard of. The recovery plan on this one is still a work in progress, expected to be completed sometime this summer. Population is estimated at 5,700. And this number over here comes from the recovery plan, the draft recovery plan that's available now. How they arrived at it, I don't know exactly. Okay, here's some of the threats, the same threats we're used to. I rate the vulnerability to poaching as medium to high, not very high, because these plants tend to be scattered, widely scattered over a large area. They're not concentrated as the nickel torch heads are, where there's a lot of them in one fairly small geographical area. But there is evidence that they've been poached. This plant here and the one we're going to show you next, we came across these in the course of a cactus rescue out south of town. We reported these. What we do with these, the club doesn't have federal permits for removing these, so moving them or relocating them. So when we see one, what we do is we inform the project manager, and in this case, I believe it was SWCA again had contracted to relocate the plants. Most of the time when we're out on a rescue, if it's in Pima pineapple habitat, SWCA has already been there and located the plants and knows where they are, and in some cases they've already moved them to a holding area. Okay, this was an interesting project too. There was a pipeline, a gas pipeline was constructed from 3 Points to the Mexican border, and that goes right through the heart of Pima pineapple habitat. Now, to comply with the endangered species law, the provision of the endangered species law, what Kinder Morgan did to bring themselves into compliance, they bought land in this mitigation land bank. Now, when they did that, they were in full compliance with the Endangered Species Act. They were free at this point, after this 400 acres of mitigation land bank was purchased. They could have gone in and bulldozed every Pima pineapple cactus in the route, along with all the other vegetation there. It was perfectly legal. No requirement in the law that they make any effort at all to salvage them. They did anyway. Kinder Morgan contracted with SWCA, so they went beyond the bare bones compliance, what the law required them to do, and that's to their credit. And I think when companies like this do something right, they get a lot of criticism from the envirotypes particularly, and I think when they do something right, when they go above and beyond bare bones compliance, they need to hear from us. They need to get a little credit for what they're doing. Another thing they did on both this and on the highway widening projects, during the planning phase, they rerouted, they made adjustments to the routes to avoid as many of the endangered cacti as possible. So we've got some good people out there who, these projects are approved, they go through the approval process, they're done. They are going to impact not only the endangered plants, but everything else. I believe at least one cactus rescue was done out of that corridor also. So some of the plants were moved, about half of them were moved to a site as close as possible outside the pipeline corridor. Others were removed back exactly to where they came from. The survival rate to date is approximately 70%. Now, on this project, again, my friend Dan Bach offered to take about a third of the plants to his nursery, pot them up, and get them well hydrated and nourished and well nourished before relocating into habitat. Again, the offer was made good faith, no cost to the Fish and Wildlife Service, but again, the permitting issue came up. They said, well, it would take several months to issue the permits, and that would not fit the timetable of the project. So there was a learning opportunity there that was lost, because that would have provided some other data to compare survival rates with how well that compared with the plants that were just moved in habitat. But anyway, that's the way that went. Okay, this is kind of interesting. I read this in there's the Desert Leaf magazine. You may see that occasionally. Pima pineapples, I've been out on a field survey, and they're easy to miss. They're small plants, they're easy to miss. You can walk within a couple of feet of one and never see that it's there. So they wanted to get a more accurate estimate, so they got Bolt, the cactus sniffing dog. He came over from California, but he was trained in California. ASDM sent some potted Pima pineapples out to so Bolt could learn to sniff them out. So he's on the job out there now. And again, Thomas may know a little bit more about this. I think John Durham said that maybe they see Bolt as maybe a threat to their jobs, you know, that he might. But anyway, I thought it was a fascinating idea. Some of the field work that Bill Peachy and I have done on the Nichols Turk's Head, those don't grow in clumps of grass like the Pima pineapples do, but still they blend in with their background so well that we may need to get a Nichols Turk's Head sniffer out there too. Okay, let's look at some other plants now, one cactus and then some others. This Yavia cryptocarpa was a fairly recent discovery. You know, the recent discoveries now are going to be small plants. You know, let's face it, the big stuff, people noticed them a long time ago. So anything that's relatively new discoveries that you see are probably going to be very small plants. The British Cactus and Succulent Society got involved with this in cooperation. CITES, here, that's a Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. They're based in Geneva, Switzerland. They're kind of the international coordinator of efforts to save not only endangered plants, but endangered animals. So working with them, they were able to get some seeds, take them back to England, give them to commercial nurseries to grow. They grew enough plants to where every member of the British Cactus and Succulent Society was given a plant, and they're growing them now for sale to the public too. So this plant, it hasn't, unfortunately, it hasn't totally eliminated the poaching, but it has helped. And even more importantly, from my perspective, is we have cultivated plants now that will be kind of an insurance policy if the wild population is cleaned out. Okay, here's another interesting conservation story. This plant was believed to be extinct, and a public-private partnership, you can see there who was involved in it, public-private partnership brought this plant back to the extent where it was actually removed from the endangered species list. Now, to be removed, to be delisted, a plant has to be, they have to rate it that there's a healthy population in the wild that is reproducing at a rate that will assure the survival of the species. So this is a really big deal when a plant that was believed to have been extinct is brought back to the point where it's not even on the endangered list anymore. And there's another good point to come out of this. Habitat destruction was the main factor in the disappearance of this plant. Most of the habitat had been destroyed for one reason or another. The Nature Conservancy came in. They're kind of the 800-pound gorilla of the conservation movement. They came in and were able to purchase land, suitable habitat for the reintroduction of this plant into the wild. Private organizations, private conservation organizations are absolutely essential to the whole effort to save endangered plants and animals as far as that goes. If government money had been available, in the unlikely event that government money would have been available to acquire habitat there, the process would probably have taken years. So private organizations, private land trusts like the Conservancy are able to move quickly when the situation calls for it, and they did. Okay, and we're going to go take a look at some endangered, what's going on in Hawaii with the National Tropical Botanical Garden. Hawaii is kind of the poster child for invasive species of plants and what they've done. If you go to Hawaii, 98% of the plants you see are invasive. They're non-indigenous plants. More than a third of all, there's 267 species of Hawaiian plants are endangered. Now, to put that into perspective, the entire land area of the Hawaiian Islands is about 1/3 smaller than Pima County, Arizona. So we're talking, and nearly half of that is on the island of Hawaii, the one they call the Big Island. So they've got a lot of critically endangered plants there, and they're doing some pretty extraordinary things, like rappelling down a cliff here to collect seeds. The last dozen or so of this particular species that were known to existed only on this cliff face, and they probably existed there because that was the place where the herbivores, the pigs, goats, couldn't get to them. They were well protected by this rugged terrain. So they rappelled down, they collected seed, and they've grown them there at the botanical garden. I'm not sure whether any of this species has been reintroduced into habitat, but they have done so with a number. Now, I think there's an object lesson here, too, for this is a good example of the kind of effort that it's going to take to save some of our more endangered cacti. As I mentioned, going back a ways with the Arizona hedgehog, the populations that have been the most decimated by over-collecting are the ones that are the easiest to get to. So the survivors, if there are any, the survivors of some of these plants that have been severely over-collected, this is where they're likely to find them. They're likely to find them in places where the plant poachers just couldn't get to them. And I show this as an example of the kind of effort that it's going to take to save some of these critically endangered cacti. Okay, so this is the nursery at the National Tropical Botanical Garden. And there are several gardens actually. This happens to be the one on the island of Kauai. These are endangered plants that are being propagated. Once they're ready, they're taken back and replanted into the wild. They're taken back and reintroduced, and then they're monitored after they're replanted. They're monitored to see that the population is healthy. Sometimes it's necessary to fence areas off to keep the herbivores out, but this is bringing things back. There are those who will tell you that reintroducing nursery-grown plants into the wild is a bad idea, and you're going to be spreading new pathogens out there. Well, we've got two good examples here. We've got the Tennessee coneflower, and we've got a number of species in Hawaii that are being successfully reintroduced into the wild. So I think I don't know of any cacti that have been any endangered cacti. I do know that Dan Bach provided a bunch of saguaros to replant into a burned over area in the McDowell Mountain Preserve up north of Phoenix. So plants are being successfully reintroduced into habitat. Okay, the Wollemi pine. This is a real interesting case here. Do you all know what an araucaria is? How many of you are familiar with araucarias? Okay, a few hands, not very many. Okay, have you ever heard of a Norfolk Island pine? Have you ever heard? Okay, a Norfolk Island pine is an araucaria. That's the one that you are most likely to be familiar with. Araucarias and cycads make up most of the logs that are in the petrified forest. So these are survivors from the age of the dinosaurs and before. This plant was rediscovered in 1974. It was thought to have been extinct for 65 million years. It was rediscovered in a very remote region of Wollemi National Park in Australia. Okay, the status, it's the equivalent of a living dinosaur. This was the botanical discovery of the 20th century. Okay, so what are they doing to save it? Taking some interesting actions. Well, here's I got to apologize for the quality of these photos. The resolution isn't real good. This is what came off the Wollomie Pine website. So, but terrain like this is the reason why this little small grove of these, there's fewer of 100 of them in the wild. And it's this rugged terrain that kept them hidden for so long and contributed to the belief that they were extinct. So, okay, so here they make this discovery. Okay, now, so what did they do? Well, they kept it a secret for years. And during those years, they gathered seeds, they took cuttings, and they started propagating plants for eventual sale to the public. They didn't want to publish it. They didn't want 1,000 people or 10,000 people running out there and trampling over the habitat. I don't know how well you can see this. The quality of the photo isn't good, but they actually collected seed by rappelling down from a helicopter. So here's the guy hanging down, and he's collecting seed to Wollomie pine to take back and propagate. Here he is again right here. You can see his hard hat on. So he's rappelled down from a helicopter. They've also gone in and spread nets like this in under the trees to collect the seed. They reportedly are getting germination rates of Wollomie pines at 90%, 95% rate. So they're having a good deal of success propagating them. Oops, let's see. Let's go to the next one. Okay. If you read any of my cactus and succulent articles, you'll know that I'm a pretty outspoken proponent of commercial propagation of endangered plants, and we'll talk about that some more in a minute. Well, with the Wollomie pine, they not only allowed commercial propagation, but they promoted it. You look at the Wollomie pine website, and they want you to buy one and grow your own plant. Unfortunately, they are not available for sale in the U.S. You wouldn't be able to grow one in Tucson anyway, except maybe in a pot indoors. But there's good news. You don't have to go all the way to Australia to see one. They've got one at the Huntington. And there it is. You'll see it's just kind of a nondescript looking thing. It does look like a pine tree. But just think that you're looking at a living dinosaur there. You're looking at a real botanical treasure. They're not available for sale in the U.S., and I don't know why particularly. This would be the largest market for plants, but I think it's because they just can't grow them fast enough. A couple of the plants that are offered for sale on the website were noted as sold out, and they're getting plant this size would probably go for about $300 or $400 Australian, which its exchange rate is about 70%. So let's say if it was 300, you're looking at a little over $200 US. So they're raising some serious money, and they're growing and selling lots of plants. And most important of all is these plants are established in many botanical gardens around the world. Should the wild population be decimated, a fire could burn through there. The entire stand, fewer than 100 plants, could be destroyed in one fire. Well, we have a backup. We have plants in cultivation now that can be grown and maybe reintroduced into habitat at some point. In situ again. There's an awful lot of desert out there, folks, and effectively policing this for plant poachers is a pretty tall order. So it's not, it's not likely that we can put, in fact, it's not even remotely possible that you can put enough cops out there to protect all the cacti that can be dug out of the desert. And we see them occasionally around. Sometimes you'll see plants being sold off the back of a truck without any permit tags on them, and you kind of have to wonder. So, despite our best efforts, we cannot adequately protect these plants in habitat. So this is why we need the backup position here. Okay, let's talk about the Endangered Species Act for a minute. The Endangered Species Act, as I mentioned a little while ago, the early draft recovery plan for the Arizona hedgehog called for propagation of up to 5,000 plants a year. The draft plan that's being developed now for the Pima pineapple doesn't say a word about ex situ conservation, doesn't mention it at all. So essentially the ESA, what it's doing is totally ignoring the reality here that plants that they cannot effectively be protected in habitat. It's not providing for a plan B. So I think it really severely limits the effectiveness of the law. Okay, the law is not well understood or consistently enforced. A lot of, well, I had one experience. I had a Pima pineapple cactus of my own. I bought it from a grower in California. He listed it, he had it online, and I ordered one from him, and he sent it to me, and it grew and thrived for several years in the pot, and then just almost overnight it died. So I don't have one here to show you, but I told him, I said, you know, you may not be aware, but that is a federally listed endangered species, and unless you have the proper permit, you can get in trouble for selling that. So I said, you might want to take that down. So I think this is kind of telling when only 11 out of 49 vendors offering endangered plants have the required permits. It shows that there's a lot of misunderstanding as to what the law requires, and I don't think many growers are going to risk federal prosecution for growing one more plant that may or may not make a lot of money for them. There was only one permitted cactus nursery. This was Mesa Gardens in Belen, New Mexico, and Stephen Brack sold his nursery out a little over a year ago. The permits were not transferable, and the new owners, I've tried to contact them. The permits, if they wanted permits to continue to grow endangered plants, now Stephen was the only one who had the permits, they'd have to apply all over again on their own. And so far as I know, they haven't done it. And we'll see why in a minute. Okay. So what do we need? ESA, the Endangered Species Act, needs to be, and I charge Fish and Wildlife with doing this, they need an outreach, education, and communication program. People need to be better, growers need to be better educated as to what the law requires. And here's my real hot button item right here. If you don't take anything away from this tonight, but this, I think we're really missing the boat by not fully engaging. We have centuries of combined experience right here in our little town of Tucson. We have centuries of combined experience of growing cacti, how to grow. We have people here who know how to grow them, and they're sitting on the sidelines. I kind of equate this to if you're in the Super Bowl when you're 20 points down in the fourth quarter and you've got your most valuable player sitting on the bench. We're not utilizing this knowledge to perpetuate our populations of endangered cacti. And to me, the situation needs to change. To incentivize, one good reason why commercial growers aren't going to be jumping at the opportunity to do this is not many business people are going to want to have a lot more involvement with the government in their business. You know, you've heard the old saying about I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. Well, that's kind of the situation, and it's unfortunate, really. There's been more of an adversarial relationship there than a cooperative relationship. One of the really important things to look at here is, you know, you've heard the old saying about not putting all your eggs in one basket. Well, see, the botanical gardens now are the sole source of propagation for endangered cacti. And they're doing the best they can with what they have to work with. But here in Arizona, we have basically three. We have Boyce Thompson, we have DBG, and we have ASDM here in Tucson, who have the necessary federal permits. So essentially, we've got a lot of our eggs are in a very small number of baskets. You take one natural disaster at any of them, a fire or a natural disaster, and that could have some very serious consequences for the whatever species it is that they're working with. And I'll give you a good example here. You may have read recently about the catastrophic floods they had on the island of Kauai. Well, that's where the National Tropical Botanical Garden is located. Fortunately, the torrential rains, 27 inches of rain in one day in some places, the torrential rains hit the north shore. The garden is on the south shore, so the garden was spared. But that's an example of what could happen to a population of endangered plants. So we need more baskets. We need more baskets to put these eggs into, these endangered plant eggs. And this is where the commercial growers come in. Okay, once again, incentivize propagation and sale. It might be a big turnoff. I think it would be for me, and I think it is for most commercial growers, to wade through a 16-page permit application and pay a $100 fee, non-refundable fee, that may or may not get you a permit in a few months' time. I'm trying to make the point to there's some good people in fish and wildlife, but I think they see paperwork. Well, paperwork really is the lifeblood of bureaucracy, and talking about expediting permitting processes and minimizing paperwork just doesn't compute very well with them. I actually mentioned to one that paperwork doesn't save plants, and she took great exception to that about how, it's such a vital element, we have to keep track. Well, you do, but maybe you could make it a little easier. Anyway, here's my goal. Supply the growers with seed. Supply the people who know how to grow plants with seed, and get out of their way and let them do what they do best, which is grow plants. This may be the last and best hope that our endangered plants have. And this needs to happen not just in the U.S., but this is, most of the hot spots for the endangered cacti, as you probably noticed, are outside the U.S., where there's a much greater diversity of species. You have situations where plants are being poached. You take an example, an impoverished rural village in central Mexico, and somebody comes in showing around photos. Do you know where I could find some of these plants? Oh yeah, sure. We'll pay you a few bucks and take us out. And then the next botanist that visits that community may find that population completely cleaned out. So rather than, and can you blame, a person who's looking to feed their family is going to, if this will help them do it, they're not going to think twice about going out and helping plant poachers find the plants they're looking for. So a better way would be to get them involved in growing plants themselves and have sustainable sources of income that would provide money that would circulate through their own economies. Okay, unprecedented cooperation is what's needed, and we're a long ways from there right now. And I've probably beaten this horse to death already, but one more time about getting the commercial nurserymen into the business here. I think it's absolutely essential. I think to the degree we're successful in doing that is pretty well going to determine the fate of a lot of these species. Okay, I'm going to leave you with a question here. If we don't save them, who will? And I mean the collective we, not just Tucson Cactus and Succulent Society. We do an exemplary job. we are the most proactive organization in the state of Arizona for saving desert plants. We're closing in on 84,000 plants rescued now. We're walking the walk and talking the talk. We're going out. We're saving plants. We're saving plants that otherwise would be bulldozed. We're providing low water use plants. We're contributing to the water conservation effort by making these plants available, as we did at Sonoran 12, making these plants available for homeowners who want to save on their water bills. We're making them available at reasonable cost. The water conservation issue is only going to get bigger as time goes by. Demand for low water use plants is going to increase. Plant poaching from the desert is probably going to increase along as the demand does. Here again, a quote from my friend Dan. He said he didn't originate this statement, but there are no rare plants, only those that haven't been propagated. Okay, one other thought here. I want to just toss out a question here, and by show of hands, how many of you would pay a few bucks extra for a plant for your own collection if you knew that money was going for rare plant research and conservation? How many of you would consider that a good investment of your money? Yeah, I think we got a pretty good showing here. Okay, so there's a point there. This is not just going to take a cooperative effort and get the commercial growers involved. It's also going to take a lot of money. And don't look to the government for this money. That's not going to happen. The government isn't going to fund it. We have to convince some of the Bill Gateses and the Warren Buffetts of the world that modest investments in saving endangered plants, that's a worthwhile investment of their money. And I talked about needed changes to the Endangered Species Act. I don't want to get political on this, but the political climate right now is not right. The time is not right for making any favorable changes. So we need to bide our time. The time may come when we could get involved. And I think, if I remember, Dick mentioned that there was some discussion along these lines with Gabby Giffords when she was in Congress. Am I right about that, Dick? Okay. Well, the time just isn't right for that right now, and we don't even want to. We want to let that sleeping dog lie for the time being. But administrations don't last forever, and the climate may be more favorable to get the endangered species law, working as I think as it was intended to work. Okay, just to wrap this up, I didn't do this by myself. I had a lot of help from a lot of good people, and here's just a few of them. Especially, I want to give some special recognition here, both to Bill Peachy. Most of the photos here are his, as you may have noticed, and Peter Ertman, who kind of walked me through the process of what it takes to get the photos into this PowerPoint format so we can show them to you. But I talked to a lot of people and got a lot of input from a lot of different sources. So that's it, folks.
Thank you so much, Bill. We're running a little bit late, so let's take about a 10-15-minute break, and we'll come back and give away some plants.
One other thing I want to say quick. I have some of the plants we talked about for some show and tell. I'll be up here front if you want to come look at them, see some of them in the flesh. So
grab a bite to eat and come see.
Was it?